My husband called me crazy and jealous last Friday night when I questioned why he came home at 2 a.m. smelling like perfume. I smiled and said, "You're right, honey." What Hudson didn't know was that I had just received an envelope from my private investigator containing 47 photos of him and his secretary Paisley in compromising situations. 8 months of calling me paranoid. 8 months of making me doubt my own sanity. But I was right the whole time. My name is Nora Flores, and at 48, I've built a reputation as one of the most meticulous financial consultants in Chicago. For 20 years, I've helped companies detect fraud, uncover hidden assets, and spot financial inconsistencies that others miss. Ironic, isn't it? Professionally, businesses pay me $500 an hour because they trust my instincts. At home, I was just the crazy wife. I've been married to Hudson Carter for 18 years. He's a corporate executive, successful, confident, and unfortunately, incredibly arrogant. We have 2 children, Mackenzie, 22, who just finished college, and Ezra, 19, starting his sophomore year. For nearly 2 decades, I've been the supportive wife who managed the household while Hudson climbed his corporate ladder. But standing in my kitchen that Friday night, watching my husband of 18 years lie to my face with such casual cruelty, I realized something profound. The same analytical skills that made me invaluable in boardrooms had been systematically dismissed and ridiculed in my own home. Let me take you back to that Friday night. The night everything changed, though Hudson had no idea. It was 2:17 a.m. when I heard his key in the lock. I'd been awake for hours, but I pretended to be asleep upstairs. When he finally came to bed, the smell hit me immediately. A floral perfume I'd never worn, mixed with wine and something else. Guilt, maybe. Saturday morning, I decided to test my theory. "How was your meeting last night?" I asked, casually, pouring his coffee the way I had for 18 years. "Late client dinner," he replied, without looking up from his phone. "You know how these things go." "Must have been some dinner. You didn't get home until after 2. That's when Hudson's entire demeanor changed. His jaw tightened, his eyes flashed with irritation, and he slammed his coffee cup down. "Here we go again. Why do you always do this, Nora? Why do you always have to question everything? You're becoming paranoid, jealous, crazy. Can't you just trust your husband?" I forced myself to smile, a skill I'd perfected over the past few months. "You're absolutely right, honey. I'm sorry." What Hudson didn't know was that the envelope from Lincoln Gonzalez had been sitting in my purse for 2 weeks. Inside were 47 high-resolution photographs that would destroy his carefully constructed lies. But more importantly, they would vindicate every instinct I'd been trained to doubt. I had been preparing for this moment for months. What started as a nagging suspicion had evolved into a full-scale investigation, and now, finally, I had proof that my sanity was intact and my marriage was a fraud. You see, this wasn't the first time Hudson had used the word crazy to describe me. It had become his favorite weapon whenever I questioned inconsistencies in his stories. But to understand how I reached this moment, sitting in my kitchen with a private investigator's report that would change everything, I need to take you back to where it all began. 6 months ago, I started noticing changes. Small things at first, the kind of details that someone in my profession is trained to catch. Hudson's phone, which used to sit casually on the kitchen counter, suddenly had a password I didn't know. His laptop, once left open on his desk, was now always closed and locked away. These weren't the behaviors of a man with nothing to hide. Then came the schedule changes. Emergency meetings that appeared on his calendar at the last minute. Client dinners that stretched past midnight. Weekend conferences in cities where I knew his company had no offices. When I'd ask about these events, Hudson would get defensive, irritated, as if my natural curiosity was somehow an attack on his character. "Why are you interrogating me?" he'd snap. "Can't you just trust me? This jealousy thing is getting out of hand, Nora." But here's what Hudson never understood about me. I'm not naturally jealous or suspicious. I'm naturally observant. It's literally what I do for a living. When a company's books don't add up, when receipts don't match expenses, when timelines don't align with claimed activities, I notice. It's pattern recognition, pure and simple. And Hudson's patterns had changed dramatically. The breaking point came 4 months ago. I made the mistake of voicing my concerns directly. "Hudson," I said one evening after he'd returned from another emergency client meeting at 11 p.m., "I feel like we're growing apart. Your schedule seems so unpredictable lately." His response was swift and brutal. "Jesus Christ, Nora. There you go again with the crazy talk. You're becoming one of those wives. Suspicious, clingy, pathetic. I work hard to provide for this family, and instead of appreciation, I get interrogated like I'm some kind of criminal. You need to get a grip on reality." That word, crazy, hit me like a physical blow, not because it hurt my feelings, but because I recognized it as a weapon, a tool of manipulation designed to make me doubt my own perceptions. In my professional life, when I pointed out inconsistencies, I was praised for my attention to detail. At home, when I noticed the exact same kinds of inconsistencies, I was crazy. That's when I made a decision that would change everything. If I was going crazy, I would prove it scientifically. I would document everything, investigate methodically, and either confirm my suspicions or put them to rest once and for all. But I would do it quietly, without Hudson's knowledge, using all the skills that had made me successful in my career. What Hudson didn't realize was that he had just given me the motivation I needed to stop being the trusting wife and start being the investigator. The first thing I did was start a private investigation file, not the kind you see in movies, just a simple folder on my laptop. Password protected, labeled personal research. Every inconsistency, every late night, every new behavior pattern got documented with dates, times, and details. Within 2 weeks, I had identified a clear pattern. Hudson's emergency meetings always seemed to occur on Tuesdays and Thursdays. His client dinners invariably happened on the same nights when his secretary, Paisley Parker, posted Instagram stories from upscale restaurants downtown. His weekend conferences coincided with her own mysterious weekend trips to the same cities. Paisley Parker, 28 years old, blonde, ambitious, and everything I used to be before 18 years of marriage and 2 children. She'd been hired as Hudson's executive assistant 8 months ago, right around the time his behavior started changing. The timing wasn't lost on me. But I needed more than circumstantial evidence. I needed proof that would stand up in court, because even then, I knew where this was heading. 3 months ago, I made a decision that would have seemed impossible to the old Nora. I contacted Kennedy Morris, one of Chicago's most respected divorce attorneys. I told her I wasn't ready to file anything yet, but I wanted to understand my options and prepare for various scenarios. Kennedy was brutally honest. "Nora, if you suspect infidelity, you need evidence. Illinois is a no-fault divorce state, but adultery can still impact spousal support and asset division. More importantly, it impacts how judges view custody arrangements and family dynamics." That conversation changed everything. Kennedy explained that the best time to gather evidence was while the cheating spouse felt secure and was making mistakes. "Once they know you're onto them," she said, "they become careful, delete evidence, and prepare their own defense." So I became patient. I became strategic. I became everything Hudson thought I wasn't capable of being. The breakthrough came 6 weeks ago, when Kennedy recommended Lincoln Gonzalez, a private investigator who specialized in marital cases. Lincoln was professional, discreet, and expensive, but Kennedy assured me he was worth every penny. "Mrs. Flores," Lincoln said during our first meeting at a coffee shop downtown, "I need you to understand something. Once we start this investigation, there's no going back. If your husband is having an affair, we will find evidence. Are you prepared for that reality?" I looked at this man, this stranger who was asking me if I was ready to destroy my marriage, and I realized I'd never been more certain of anything in my life. "Mr. Gonzalez," I said, "I've been living with uncertainty for months. I'd rather live with painful truth than comfortable lies." Lincoln's investigation began immediately. Within a week, he had confirmed what I already knew in my heart. Hudson and Paisley were having an affair, and they weren't being particularly careful about hiding it. The photos Lincoln provided were devastating, but not surprising. Hudson and Paisley entering the Marriott downtown together. Hudson and Paisley sharing intimate dinners at restaurants I recognized from her Instagram. Hudson and Paisley in his car in the parking garage of her apartment complex, engaging in behavior that left no doubt about the nature of their relationship. But Lincoln didn't stop there. He provided financial records showing that Hudson had been using our joint credit card to pay for hotel rooms, expensive dinners, and gifts that I never received. He documented phone records showing hundreds of calls and texts between Hudson and Paisley, often late at night when Hudson claimed to be working. Most damning of all, Lincoln discovered that Paisley had been promoted twice in 8 months, unusual for someone with her limited experience, and that she was now earning a salary higher than employees who had been with the company for years. The evidence was overwhelming, methodical, and legally admissible. Everything I would need if this went to court. But here's what struck me most about the entire investigation. I felt no surprise, only validation. Every instinct I'd had, every suspicion Hudson had dismissed as crazy, every pattern I'd noticed. It was all confirmed in Lincoln's report. This wasn't the first time Hudson had used his manipulation tactics on me. Looking back over our 18-year marriage, I could see a clear pattern of dismissal and gaslighting that had started small and grown more aggressive over time. Early in our marriage, when I'd point out financial discrepancies or question unusual expenses, Hudson would laugh it off. "You're so detail-oriented, honey. Sometimes a cigar is just a cigar." But when my concerns proved correct, like the time I caught his business partner embezzling funds, Hudson never acknowledged my contribution. Instead, he'd take credit for discovering the problem himself. Then there was the incident with our former nanny, Allison Reed. I'd noticed small amounts of cash missing from my purse, jewelry that seemed to move locations, and a general feeling that our belongings were being rifled through. When I mentioned it to Hudson, his response was swift and cutting. "Nora, you're being paranoid. Allison is wonderful with the kids. Your jealousy of younger women is becoming a real problem." But I trusted my instincts and installed a small security camera in our bedroom. Within a week, I had footage of Allison stealing money from my wallet and photographing our financial documents with her phone. When I showed Hudson the evidence, his response wasn't an apology for doubting me. It was annoyance that I'd gone behind his back to prove my point. "You should have trusted me to handle it," he said, as if he hadn't spent weeks calling me paranoid and jealous. That was Hudson's pattern. Dismiss my concerns, gaslight my perceptions, then rewrite history when I proved correct. Over 18 years, this systematic invalidation had eroded my confidence in my own judgment. I'd started second-guessing myself, questioning my instincts and accepting Hudson's version of reality over my own observations. His affair with Paisley was just the latest and most devastating example of this pattern. For months, Hudson had been telling me I was paranoid, jealous, and imagining things. For months, I'd started to doubt my own perceptions. But now I had proof that my analytical mind, the same mind that companies trusted with millions of dollars, had been working perfectly all along. The only thing that had been broken was my marriage. While Lincoln was gathering evidence, I was preparing for the aftermath. Kennedy had been right about timing. Hudson felt so secure in his deception that he was making increasingly careless mistakes. He'd forgotten to delete text messages. He'd left receipts in his pants pockets. He'd even started taking calls from Paisley while I was in the same room, thinking I was too crazy to figure out what was happening. But I was documenting everything. Every lie, every manipulation, every time he made me feel like I was losing my mind. I kept a detailed journal of his gaslighting techniques, his patterns of deflection, and his increasing cruelty whenever I questioned his behavior. The journal became my lifeline during those dark months of investigation. Writing down Hudson's exact words, his tone, his facial expressions when he called me crazy, it helped me see the manipulation clearly. Reading back over my entries, I could see how calculated his responses were, how he'd learned exactly which buttons to push to make me doubt myself. March 15th, one entry read, "Hudson came home at 11:47 p.m., claiming client dinner ran late. When I mentioned the restaurant he named was closed on Mondays, he flew into a rage about my obsessive fact-checking and said I was becoming impossible to live with. He stormed out, claiming he needed space from my toxic behavior, classic deflection, and blame-shifting. Reading my own words, documented in real time, made it impossible to dismiss my concerns or accept Hudson's rewriting of events. The pattern was clear, consistent, and deeply troubling. Meanwhile, I was also preparing practically for what I knew was coming. Kennedy had walked me through the financial implications of divorce, and I realized I needed to protect myself and my children's future. I quietly organized all our financial documents, made copies of important papers, and opened my own bank account for the first time in 15 years. I also started rebuilding my professional network. During my marriage, I'd scaled back my consulting practice to focus on the family, but now I reached out to former colleagues, updated my credentials, and began positioning myself for financial independence. 2 weeks ago, Lincoln delivered his final report. 47 photographs, 16 hours of surveillance footage, financial records spanning 8 months, and a timeline that perfectly documented the affair from beginning to present. But the report contained more than just evidence of infidelity. Lincoln had uncovered a level of deception that went beyond the affair itself. Hudson had been lying about finances, creating fake business trips to cover personal expenses, and even using company resources to fund his relationship with Paisley. The man I'd been married to for 18 years wasn't just unfaithful, he was systematically dishonest about every aspect of his life. As I sat in my car in the parking lot of Lincoln's office, holding an envelope that contained the destruction of my 18-year marriage, I felt something unexpected. Relief, not happiness, not vindication, but pure, clean relief. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't paranoid. I wasn't imagining things. I was a woman whose instincts had been correct all along, and I finally had the proof to back them up. More importantly, I was a woman who was about to take back control of her own life. That brings us back to last Friday night, the night I decided to stop being the victim and start being the victor. Hudson came home at 2:17 a.m., reeking of Paisley's perfume and wine, confident that his crazy wife would either be asleep or too intimidated to confront him. What he didn't expect was to find me sitting calmly at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and a manila envelope. "You're up late," he said, his voice carrying that familiar edge of annoyance. "Couldn't sleep," I replied, keeping my tone light. "How was your evening?" "Late client meeting. I told you this morning." His lie came so easily, so automatically, that I almost admired his skill. "With Paisley?" The question hung in the air like a bomb with a lit fuse. Hudson's entire body went rigid, his face cycling through confusion, panic, and then his default setting, aggressive deflection. "What the hell kind of question is that? Paisley is my assistant, Nora. She takes notes at meetings. You're being paranoid again." I reached across the table and opened the manila envelope, pulling out a single photograph. It showed Hudson and Paisley in a passionate embrace outside the Marriott downtown, taken 3 days earlier. I placed it on the table between us, like a card in a poker game. "This doesn't look like note-taking to me." For the first time in our 18-year marriage, Hudson was completely speechless. I watched his face as the reality of his situation sank in. The arrogance, the condescension, the casual cruelty he'd shown me for months. All of it evaporated in an instant. "Where did you get this?" he finally whispered. "Hudson," I said, my voice steady and calm. "You've been calling me crazy for 8 months. But what's crazy is thinking you could have an affair with your secretary, and I wouldn't notice. What's crazy is using our joint credit card to pay for hotel rooms and thinking I wouldn't see the statements. What's crazy is believing that a woman who catches financial fraud for a living couldn't catch you." I pulled out a second photo, Hudson and Paisley entering the hotel together. Then a third, them having dinner at Romano's, the restaurant where Hudson had proposed to me 18 years earlier. "Nora, I can explain." "No," I interrupted, my voice quiet but firm. "You can't. Because there's nothing to explain. I know about the hotel room you've been renting every Tuesday and Thursday. I know about the trips to Milwaukee that Paisley took on the exact same weekends as your business conferences. I know about the promotion you gave her after 2 months on the job. I know about the salary increase that came right after you started sleeping with her." Hudson's face had gone completely white. "How do you know all this?" "Because I hired a private investigator 6 weeks ago. Because I've been documenting your behavior for months. Because I stopped trusting your version of reality and started trusting my own instincts." I reached into the envelope again, this time pulling out Lincoln's complete report. 47 photographs, financial records, phone logs, surveillance footage, everything Hudson thought he'd hidden so carefully. "This is impossible," Hudson said, his voice barely audible. "You can't afford A private investigator? Actually, I can. I opened my own bank account 2 months ago. Funny thing about being a financial consultant. I'm very good at moving money around without being noticed. The irony wasn't lost on me. Hudson had been so busy covering his own tracks that he'd never thought to monitor mine. Nora, please, let's talk about this rationally. You're obviously upset. Upset? I laughed, and the sound surprised even me. It wasn't bitter or angry. It was genuinely amused. Hudson, I'm not upset. I'm liberated. For 8 months, you've been telling me I'm crazy, paranoid, imagining things. For 8 months, I've been doubting my own sanity. But it turns out I was right about everything. I spread more photos across the table, like a dealer revealing a winning hand. Hudson and Paisley at restaurants, hotels, even in his office after hours. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. I've been wrong about a lot of things in our marriage, I continued, but I wasn't wrong about this. My instincts were perfect. My observations were accurate. My conclusions were correct. The only thing that was broken was my confidence in myself. And you made sure of that, didn't you? Hudson tried to gather himself, falling back on his old patterns of manipulation. Nora, you're not thinking clearly. This looks worse than it is. Paisley and I, we got close, yes. But it's not what you think. It's exactly what I think, I said, cutting him off. And it's exactly what Lincoln Gonzalez documented over 6 weeks of surveillance. Would you like to see the video footage, or are the photos sufficient? Video footage. Hudson's voice cracked. I pulled out my phone and played a brief clip that Lincoln had sent me. Hudson and Paisley in the hotel lobby, their body language making their relationship unmistakably clear. The audio is particularly interesting, I said, pausing the video, especially the part where Paisley asks if your crazy wife suspects anything, and you assure her that I'm too stupid and paranoid to figure it out. Hudson buried his face in his hands. Jesus Christ, Nora. What do you want? What do I want? I considered the question. I want you to understand that the woman you've been calling crazy just outsmarted you completely. I want you to realize that the woman you thought was too paranoid and jealous to see what was happening has been 3 steps ahead of you for weeks. The kitchen was silent, except for the ticking of the clock Hudson had given me for our 10th anniversary. The irony of time, how it reveals everything eventually. But mostly, I continued, I want you to know that I'm done. Done with the lies, done with the gaslighting, done with being made to feel crazy for noticing things that were really happening. Done with you. Hudson looked up, his eyes red and desperate. You can't mean that. We have 18 years together. We have kids. You can't throw that all away because of one mistake. One mistake? I pulled out Lincoln's timeline, a detailed chronology of Hudson's affair that spanned 8 months. Hudson, this wasn't one mistake. This was a systematic pattern of deception, manipulation, and betrayal. And it wasn't just the affair. It was how you treated me when I questioned what was happening. I stood up and walked to the kitchen counter, where I'd placed another envelope earlier that evening. Every time I expressed a concern, you made me feel like I was losing my mind. Every time I pointed out an inconsistency, you told me I was being paranoid. Every time my instincts told me something was wrong, you convinced me that I couldn't trust my own perceptions. I returned to the table with the second envelope. That stops now. I opened the envelope and pulled out a document that made Hudson's face go completely pale. Divorce papers, already filed, with Kennedy Morris's signature at the bottom. These were filed yesterday, I said calmly. You'll be served officially on Monday morning. Hudson stared at the papers like they were written in a foreign language. You can't be serious. Nora, please, we can work through this. Couples therapy, counseling, whatever you want. What I want, I said, is what I'm getting. My life back, my sanity back, my confidence back. Everything you tried to take away from me over the past 8 months. The beautiful thing about having all the evidence was that Hudson couldn't argue with facts. He couldn't tell me I was imagining things or being paranoid when I had photographs and documentation of everything he'd done. The kids, he started. Already know, I said. I showed Mackenzie and Ezra the evidence this morning. They're adults, Hudson. They can handle the truth. And the truth is that their father has been lying to their mother for 8 months and then calling her crazy when she noticed. Hudson's face went through another series of emotions: shock, anger, desperation, and finally, something that looked like acceptance. "How long have you known?" he asked quietly. "I've suspected for 6 months. I've had proof for 2 weeks. But I've been certain since the first time you called me crazy for asking legitimate questions." I gathered the photos back into the envelope, my movements calm and methodical. "You see, Hudson, you made a critical error. You assumed that because I loved you, I would accept your version of reality over my own perceptions. You thought that 18 years of marriage gave you the right to gaslight me into submission. But you forgot something important." I stood up, the envelope in my hands. "I'm not just your wife. I'm a forensic financial investigator. It's my job to uncover lies, follow paper trails, and document deception. Did you really think I wouldn't eventually turn those skills on my own marriage?" Hudson remained silent, staring at the table where the evidence of his betrayal had been laid out so methodically. "The funniest part," I continued, "is that you made it so easy. You were so confident that I was too crazy and paranoid to figure it out that you stopped being careful. You left receipts in your pockets. You forgot to clear your browser history. You took calls from Paisley while I was in the room." I walked toward the kitchen door, then turned back. "You called me crazy, Hudson, but crazy would have been staying married to a man who lies to my face and then tells me I'm imagining it. Crazy would have been accepting your gaslighting instead of trusting my own instincts. Crazy would have been believing your version of reality when my own observations told me otherwise." I paused at the doorway. What I did was sane, methodical, and strategic. I investigated, gathered evidence, consulted with professionals, and made an informed decision about my future. The only crazy thing would have been doing anything else. As I left Hudson sitting alone in our kitchen, surrounded by the wreckage of his lies, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: complete clarity. The fog of confusion and self-doubt that had clouded my judgment was finally lifting. But the night wasn't over. I had one more revelation to deliver. I walked upstairs to my home office, where I'd been conducting my own investigation parallel to Lincoln's. While Hudson thought I was going crazy, I'd actually been building the most comprehensive case of financial and personal fraud I'd ever assembled. My phone buzzed, a text message from an unknown number. "Is it done? Did you tell him?" I smiled and typed back, "Phase 1 complete. You're up next, Paisley." You see, what Hudson didn't know, what he couldn't have known because he'd so completely underestimated me, was that I hadn't just been investigating his affair, I'd been investigating Paisley Parker's entire life. And what I'd discovered was going to destroy them both. The next morning, Saturday, Hudson was gone when I woke up. Probably at Paisley's apartment, crying on her shoulder about his crazy wife who had somehow figured everything out. Let them have their moment of comfort. It would be their last. At 9 a.m., my phone rang. Kennedy Morris. "It's done," she said simply. "The papers were filed yesterday as planned. But Nora, I have to ask, are you sure about the additional measures we discussed?" "Absolutely certain," I replied. "Hudson made this personal when he tried to convince me I was losing my mind. Paisley made it personal when she actively participated in that gaslighting. They both need to understand the full consequences of their choices." "The employment fraud angle is particularly strong," Kennedy continued, "using company resources for personal relationships, fraudulent expense reports, the questionable promotions. Hudson's company is going to be very interested in this information." "That's the point," I said. "Actions have consequences. If they wanted to have an affair, that's between them and their consciences. But the moment they started stealing from Hudson's company to fund their relationship, it became a legal matter." What Kennedy was referring to was another aspect of Lincoln's investigation that I hadn't shared with Hudson the night before. Not only had Hudson been cheating with Paisley, but they'd been systematically defrauding his company to finance their affair. The hotel rooms weren't just paid for with our personal credit card. Hudson had also been submitting fake expense reports to his company, claiming the hotel stays were for business purposes. The expensive dinners were being written off as client entertainment, even though no clients were present. The gifts Hudson bought for Paisley were being purchased through the company's vendor accounts and disguised as office supplies. In my professional life, I'd seen executives lose everything for exactly this kind of fraud. Hudson and Paisley had been stealing from his company for months, creating a paper trail that would be impossible to explain away. "When does the company receive the evidence package?" I asked Kennedy. "Monday morning, same time Hudson gets served with the divorce papers. Your timing is flawless, Nora. He'll be dealing with the divorce, the company investigation, and the criminal fraud charges all at once." "And Paisley?" "Will be terminated Monday morning for cause. The evidence of her participation in the fraud is just as strong as Hudson's. No severance, no references, and potential criminal charges, depending on what the company decides to pursue." I felt a moment of something that might have been pity for Paisley. She was young, probably genuinely believed Hudson when he told her that his marriage was already over, that he was planning to leave me anyway. But that pity quickly faded when I remembered the audio recording Lincoln had captured of her laughing about Hudson's crazy paranoid wife, who was too stupid to figure out what was happening. "There's one more thing," Kennedy said. "The prenup you signed when you got married. It has an infidelity clause that I need to remind you about. If Hudson is found to have committed adultery, he forfeits his claim to half the marital assets." I had completely forgotten about that clause. Hudson had insisted on the prenup when we got married, claiming it was standard for executives at his level. I'd signed it without much thought, trusting that we'd never need it. Now it was going to protect me in ways I'd never imagined. "So he loses everything?" I asked. "Everything. The house, the investment accounts, the retirement funds. It all stays with you. He'll be left with his personal belongings and whatever assets he can prove he owned before the marriage." The irony was perfect. Hudson's own arrogance and need to protect his assets had created the legal mechanism for his financial destruction. After hanging up with Kennedy, I decided to take a walk through our neighborhood, the same neighborhood where Hudson and I had planned to grow old together, where we'd raised our children, where I'd believed we were building a life based on trust and mutual respect. As I walked past the houses where our friends lived, friends who would soon learn the truth about Hudson's affair, I realized something profound. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't hurt. I wasn't even disappointed. I was free. For 8 months, I'd been trapped in Hudson's version of reality, a place where my observations were paranoid, my instincts were crazy, and my intelligence was constantly questioned and undermined. But now I was back in the real world, where evidence mattered, where patterns told stories, and where my professional skills were exactly what I needed to reclaim my life. My phone rang again. This time it was Mackenzie. "Mom, are you okay? Dad came by my apartment this morning completely falling apart. He's saying you filed for divorce, that you hired investigators, that you've lost your mind." "What do you think, sweetheart?" I asked. "Do I sound like I've lost my mind?" There was a pause. "Actually, you sound clearer than you have in months. Dad's been saying you were acting paranoid and jealous, but every time I talked to you, you seemed, I don't know, more like yourself than you'd been in a while." "That's because I was finally trusting myself again instead of accepting your father's version of what was happening." "So it's true? About the affair?" "It's true. I have extensive documentation. Would you like to see it?" Another pause. "Do I want to see photos of my father cheating on my mother? Number. Do I need to see them to understand why you're divorcing him? Also number, I believe you, Mom. Dad's been different lately. More aggressive, more defensive. We all noticed." That afternoon, Ezra called with a similar conversation. Both of my children, it turned out, had been concerned about Hudson's behavior for months. They'd noticed his increased irritability, his defensiveness, his tendency to lash out when questioned about anything. "You're handling this exactly right, Mom," Ezra said. "Dad always taught us that actions have consequences. Well, these are his consequences." Sunday passed quietly. Hudson didn't come home, which was fine with me. I spent the day organizing the house, packing up photos and mementos from our marriage, preparing for the new life that was beginning. Monday morning arrived with the precision of a military operation. At 8 a.m., Hudson was served with divorce papers at his office. At 8:15 a.m., his company's HR director received a comprehensive package documenting his fraudulent expense reports and misuse of company resources. At 8:30 a.m., Paisley Parker was called into a meeting that would end with her termination and the beginning of an internal investigation into her role in the fraud. My phone started ringing at 8:45 a.m. "Nora, what the hell have you done?" Hudson's voice was panicked, desperate. "They're saying I committed fraud. They're talking about criminal charges. This is insane." "Is it?" I asked calmly. "You used company money to fund your affair. You submitted false expense reports. You gave your girlfriend promotions and raises she didn't earn. In my professional opinion, that's textbook fraud. You're destroying my career. You're destroying my life." "No, Hudson. You destroyed your career when you decided to steal from your company. You destroyed your life when you decided to have an affair and then gaslight your wife for noticing. I just documented what you'd already done." The calls continued throughout the day. Hudson, desperate and angry. Paisley, crying and begging me to call off the investigation, as if I had any control over his company's response to evidence of fraud. Hudson's mother, Genesis Stewart, furious that I was destroying her son over a minor indiscretion. "Mrs. Stewart," I told her calmly, "your son has been lying to me for 8 months, and then calling me crazy when I questioned his lies. That's not a minor indiscretion. That's psychological abuse. And the fraud charges aren't coming from me. They're coming from his company's legal department." By Tuesday, the news had spread through our social circle. Friends were calling, some supportive, others confused, all wanting to know what had really happened. "I always thought you two had the perfect marriage," my friend Brooke Rivera said over coffee. "So did I replied. Turns out the only thing perfect about it was Hudson's ability to lie and my willingness to believe him. But what surprised me most was how many women reached out to share their own stories of gaslighting, of having their instincts dismissed, of being called crazy for noticing things that were really happening. "You did what I wish I'd had the courage to do," one friend told me. "You trusted yourself instead of him." That was exactly right. For 8 months, I'd been in a battle between my own perceptions and Hudson's version of reality. He'd convinced me that my observations were wrong, my instincts were unreliable, and my intelligence was flawed. But my observations had been perfect. My instincts had been completely accurate. My intelligence had been exactly what I needed to uncover the truth. The only thing that had been flawed was my willingness to trust Hudson's word over my own experience. But the real climax of this story wasn't the divorce papers or even the fraud charges. It was what happened 3 weeks later when I got a call that changed everything. "Mrs. Flores?" The voice was unfamiliar, professional. "This is Detective Sarah Martinez with the Chicago Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit. We need to speak with you about your husband's case." I met Detective Martinez at a coffee shop downtown, the same one where I'd first met Lincoln Gonzalez. "Mrs. Flores, your husband's company filed a formal complaint about the fraud, but during our investigation, we discovered something much larger. Hudson and Paisley weren't just stealing from his company. They were part of a systematic embezzlement scheme that goes back over 2 years." My blood ran cold. "What do you mean?" "The fake expense reports, the inflated vendor payments, the unauthorized salary increases. It was all part of a larger pattern. Hudson was skimming money from company accounts and funneling it through fake consulting contracts. Paisley was creating false invoices and processing fraudulent payments. We're talking about over $500,000 in stolen funds. $500,000. $500,000 that Hudson had stolen while coming home every night and calling me paranoid for questioning his behavior. The affair was almost secondary," Detective Martinez continued. "It looks like Paisley approached Hudson about the embezzlement scheme first, and the personal relationship developed from there. She needed someone with his level of access to authorize the payments." "So she seduced him to get access to the company's money?" "That's our working theory. Paisley Parker has done this before. She worked for a company in Milwaukee that went bankrupt after similar embezzlement. She was never charged because they couldn't prove her involvement. But the pattern is identical. Not only had Hudson betrayed our marriage, but he'd been manipulated by a professional criminal who had targeted him specifically for his access to company funds. Mrs. Flores, I have to ask, did you notice any changes in your household finances over the past 2 years? Any unexplained income, luxury purchases, anything that seemed inconsistent with his salary? I thought back over the past 2 years. Hudson had been oddly generous lately. Expensive gifts for the kids, a kitchen renovation I'd thought we couldn't afford, a new car that he'd claimed was a company bonus. He said he'd gotten several bonuses, I said slowly. Performance bonuses, profit-sharing payments. I never questioned them because they weren't outrageous amounts, and his company has always done well. Those weren't bonuses. That was stolen money. Hudson was essentially laundering the embezzled funds through your household finances, making it look like legitimate income. Not only had I been gaslighted about the affair, but I'd been unknowingly living off stolen money, the renovations to our house, the private school tuition for the kids, the family vacations. It had all been funded by Hudson's crimes. What happens now? I asked. Hudson and Paisley are both facing federal fraud charges. The FBI has taken over the investigation because it involves wire fraud across state lines. They're looking at 10 to 15 years in federal prison if convicted. Federal prison. Hudson wasn't just losing his job and his marriage, he was looking at spending the next decade of his life behind bars. And the money? Will have to be repaid through asset forfeiture. The house, the cars, the investment accounts, anything purchased with the stolen funds will be seized to compensate the company. Everything. Hudson's embezzlement meant that not only would we lose everything in the divorce, but the government would seize our assets to repay his victims. Mrs. Flores, I need you to understand something. You're not in any legal jeopardy. Our investigation shows clearly that you had no knowledge of the embezzlement, but you will be impacted financially. Detective Martinez, I said, I want to help your investigation in any way I can. You do? Absolutely. Hudson made me think I was crazy for 8 months. He manipulated me, lied to me, and tried to convince me that my own perceptions were wrong. If he was stealing money the entire time and using our life together as a cover for his crimes, then I want him to face the full consequences of his actions. Over the next week, I met with federal investigators, providing them with financial records, timelines, and documentation of Hudson's behavior patterns. My analytical skills, the same ones Hudson had dismissed as paranoid, were exactly what the FBI needed to build their case. The agents were impressed by the detailed records I'd kept during my own investigation. Mrs. Flores, one agent told me, you've essentially done half our work for us. This level of documentation is extraordinary. I'm a forensic financial investigator, I replied. It's what I do. Well, you're very good at it. Have you ever considered working with law enforcement? That conversation planted a seed that would grow into something beautiful later. Meanwhile, Hudson's world was collapsing in real time. The company fired him immediately and filed a civil lawsuit for damages. The FBI seized his passport and froze his personal accounts. Paisley had already fled to Mexico, leaving Hudson to face the charges alone. His mother, Genesis Stewart, called me crying. Nora, please, you have to help him. This is destroying our family. Mrs. Stewart, I said calmly, Hudson destroyed your family when he decided to steal $500,000 and have an affair with his accomplice. I didn't make these choices. He did. The beautiful irony was that Hudson's own prenuptial agreement, designed to protect his assets from me, now protected me from his criminal liability. Because we had kept separate financial identities on paper, I could prove that I had no knowledge of or involvement in his crimes. Kennedy Morris called, with updates. Nora, the government is offering you a deal. If you cooperate fully with the investigation, they'll allow you to keep any assets that can be proven to come from your separate income, your consulting business, your retirement account, even the car that's in your name only. I'll take it, I said without hesitation. Material things can be replaced. My integrity can't be. 6 weeks later, Hudson was arrested at his temporary apartment. The news coverage was extensive. Local executive charged in $500,000 embezzlement scheme. The same man who had called me crazy for noticing inconsistencies was now front-page news for financial fraud. Paisley was extradited from Mexico 2 weeks later. Her attempt to withdraw stolen money while on the run added additional charges to her case. The trial preparation took months, but the outcome was never really in doubt. The evidence was overwhelming, and my documentation had provided prosecutors with a timeline that perfectly corroborated the financial records. During the trial, I was called as a witness for the prosecution. Standing in that courtroom, looking at Hudson in his prison jumpsuit, I felt something I hadn't expected: pity. This man who had seemed so powerful, so confident, so sure of his ability to manipulate everyone around him, he looked broken. "Mrs. Flores," the prosecutor asked, "when your husband called you paranoid and crazy for questioning his behavior, how did that make you feel?" "At first it made me doubt myself," I replied, "but eventually it made me more determined to document everything. My husband forgot that questioning inconsistencies isn't paranoia, it's exactly what I do for a living." The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Guilty on all counts. Hudson was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. Paisley received 8 years after agreeing to testify against Hudson and reveal the location of additional stolen funds. The judge's comments during sentencing were particularly satisfying. "Mr. Carter, you didn't just steal money from your employer, you systematically psychologically abused your wife, attempting to convince her that her accurate observations were signs of mental instability. This kind of gaslighting is a form of emotional abuse that this court takes very seriously." As I walked out of that courthouse, I realized that the woman who had been called crazy for 8 months had just helped put 2 criminals in federal prison. The same instincts Hudson had dismissed as paranoia had uncovered a $500,000 embezzlement scheme. The same attention to detail he'd called obsessive had provided law enforcement with the evidence they needed for conviction. The same analytical skills he'd ridiculed as neurotic had exposed both his affair and his crimes. Hudson had spent 8 months trying to convince me that I couldn't trust my own perceptions, but my perceptions had been flawless from the beginning. That was 18 months ago. Today, as I sit in my new apartment overlooking Lake Michigan, I can honestly say that my life is better than it ever was during my marriage to Hudson. The FBI agent who suggested I consider working with law enforcement wasn't joking. 6 months after Hudson's sentencing, I was offered a position as a consultant with the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Financial Crimes Division. My job is to help other victims of financial fraud and train agents in recognizing the patterns of deception that I'd become so skilled at detecting. It turns out that my experience with Hudson's gaslighting made me uniquely qualified to work with other victims of financial abuse. I can recognize the signs of manipulation, the patterns of psychological control, and the systematic erosion of self-confidence that financial criminals use to keep their victims compliant. My consulting practice has also flourished. Word spread quickly through Chicago's business community about the woman who had uncovered a $500,000 embezzlement scheme in her own marriage. Companies now pay me premium rates to audit their financial systems and train their employees to spot fraud. Mackenzie and Ezra have both grown stronger through this experience. Mackenzie graduated from college with honors and is now working at a nonprofit that helps women escape abusive relationships. "You showed me what strength looks like, Mom," she told me recently. Ezra changed his major to criminal justice and wants to work for the FBI after graduation. "Dad taught me that actions have consequences," he said, "but you taught me that the truth always comes out, even when people try to hide it." As for Hudson, he's serving his 12-year sentence at a federal prison in Ohio. I've had no contact with him since the trial, and I don't plan to. The man I was married to for 18 years was a fiction, a character he created to hide his true nature as a manipulator and criminal. Paisley was released after serving 5 years and moved back to Milwaukee. I heard through Kennedy Morris that she's working at a gas station and living with her parents. Her attempt to run a sophisticated financial scam cost her everything. Genesis Stewart sent me a letter last Christmas, apologizing for not believing me when I tried to tell her about Hudson's behavior. I wrote her back, thanking her for the apology, but explaining that I'd moved forward and couldn't maintain a relationship that reminded me of that painful period. The house was eventually sold by the government, with the proceeds going to repay Hudson's company and his other victims. I used my portion of the sale to put down payment on my Lakeview apartment and invest the rest for my retirement. But the most important thing I gained from this experience wasn't financial. It was the absolute certainty that I can trust my own perceptions. For 18 years, I'd allowed Hudson to second-guess my instincts, to make me doubt my own intelligence, to convince me that my professional skills somehow didn't apply to my personal life. Now I know better. The same analytical mind that made me successful in business was perfectly capable of detecting fraud in my marriage. The same attention to detail that impressed corporate clients was exactly what I needed to uncover Hudson's crimes. I just needed to learn to trust myself. 6 months ago, I started speaking at conferences about financial fraud and domestic manipulation. My presentation is called Trust Your Instincts: When Professional Skills Meet Personal Deception. I tell my story to audiences of business professionals, law enforcement officers, and victim advocacy groups. The response is always the same. Dozens of people approach me afterward to share their own stories of being called crazy for noticing things that were really happening. "You gave me permission to trust myself again," one woman told me after a presentation in Denver. "I've been called crazy for so long that I started to believe it. But hearing your story reminded me that my instincts are usually right." That's the real lesson of my story. When someone repeatedly tells you that your perceptions are wrong, your instincts are flawed, and your intelligence can't be trusted, that's exactly when you need to trust yourself the most. Hudson called me crazy and jealous, but I was right the whole time. And now I'm free to be as analytical, observant, and intuitive as I want to be, without anyone telling me that my greatest strengths are actually weaknesses. That's not crazy. That's sanity. And every morning when I wake up in my peaceful apartment, free from manipulation and gaslighting, I'm reminded of the most important lesson of all. The woman who trusts her instincts isn't crazy. She's powerful.